So I heard the story of something simple and beautiful that happened to a member of our church and asked him if I could share it with you this morning. Some of you will know Jim Stansfield, whose wife Janet Snover died earlier in the year. It was a remarkable thing to witness from a distance, this love story of these two, as Jim devotedly cared for Janet through her medical struggles over the course of many years. And it's touching to hear him speak of their love affair over almost 40 years of marriage. As a mathematician, Jim does not necessarily go looking for signs beyond the realm of equations and numbers, but he shared with me that one afternoon, a few weeks after Janet's death, he was walking down the path by Mill Pond across from the UU church where the fish ladder is before you cross the bridge into town. And he was standing there remembering the day that he and Janet had sat there decades ago under the shade of a large birch tree and had a conversation that led them to the decision to move here to Winchester. He was remembering the excitement they felt, rooted in the love that they shared and all the promise of what the future would hold. And as he stood there, again amidst the grief of her absence, his heart was full up with a sense of her as he looked over the water and across the town. Once the reverie moment had passed, he turned to continue walking and he glanced at the wall that banks the pathway that leads up to the library. And there was scrawled on the wall a heart with the initials JS in it, both of their initials. The writer Rushnell Squire refers to such experiences as God winks, these moments that seem to just come to suggest to us that there is something more happening behind the scenes of our lives than we can possibly know, a whisper from another dimension that says, you are not alone, or there is a larger and more benevolent force at play than you can imagine, or in Jim's instance, love is here and does not die. A whisper to Jim that calls him not to stop too long at death's door and what has been lost, but an invitation to continue on in the unfolding of God's miraculous life, of which Janet is still a part. God winks. You can miss them so easily by just not paying attention. They are subtle and quiet, and even if you do catch them, they are often easily dismissible as coincidence or an odd convergence of factors. But they are there as indications that there is a God in the midst of all of this, and that this God is not distant, but very near and intimate to our lives. Now, why it has to be subtle and a missable thing, such as God winks and not God shouts or God hits me over the head with a 2x4, which is sometimes what I feel like I need, I'm not sure I can say why. But I've heard it said that God's communications must be subtle so as not to overwhelm us and to keep intact our essential human freedom. If God used more dramatic methods like, let's say, a natural disaster or plagues to get our attention, we'd be overpowered and then subjugated to such a presence. How could we freely choose? We do pay more attention to God when such things happen, but I'm loath to suggest that God causes them for God's purposes. I've also heard it said that God uses subtlety and even darkness and obscurity in God's work in our lives, because if we knew where God was bringing us, what God was growing us towards, we'd likely sabotage the process. We are meant to live life moment by moment, taking what comes day by day, and not to know the overarching plan or the end of our days. The way the writer of the book of Ecclesiastes puts it is, God has set eternity into the human heart, but in such a way that we cannot see the scope of God's work from beginning to end. So maybe some of that is some of the why behind God's subtlety, but I don't always appreciate it, I have to say. I remember as a kid, I would sit in the congregation at First Baptist Church, Richmond, Virginia, and as the preacher was preaching and my mind was drifting, which I'm really glad that never happens to you all, I would look at the stained glass window above the baptismal font at the front of our sanctuary, and I would sit there and look at Jesus standing there in the River Jordan and look into his eyes and say to God, come on, just once, God, just make Jesus's eyes blink once, and then I'll know it's true. And you know what? They never blinked once. That stained glass window stayed glass window. And I remember thinking, I wish I was alive in your time so I could have met you and known you, Jesus, and then everything would have been so much clearer than it seems to me now. But you know how clear everything was for the disciples throughout their time with Jesus? Not very. And do you know on that first Easter morning how simple and clarifying things were to the people who experienced the resurrected body of Jesus? Hardly at all. Clarity was when someone who was dead stayed dead and Jesus didn't. Clarity was if the ghost of Jesus appeared, because sometimes people see ghosts and it's kind of a strange and mysterious afterlife thing, but something that you at least have heard about and have some context for. But this wasn't that either. This was a glorified, risen body, which we say now, after hearing that for so many years across our tradition, yeah, resurrected, glorified, risen body. But for them, there was absolutely no context for that. And the disciples were like, what the heck is happening? Probably using some more colorful Aramaic word for heck. So even here, at the fulcrum of human history, where we say as Christians that God acted in a way God had never acted in human history before, on that first Easter morn, while it wasn't exactly subtle, whatever God was doing, maybe it was a little more than winking at us, but it was still obscure, unsettling, disorienting. And there was enough subtlety so that even with rolled stones and earthquakes and angels sitting in tombs and gardeners who weren't who they said they would be, there were a lot of questions. In fact, the resurrection, similar to the whole life of Jesus as the disciples experienced it, was less the answer to all their questions and more the great question that disrupted all of their pat answers. The resurrection was somehow about life emerging out of death, about fullness coming from emptiness, direction out of chaos, hope out of despair. But all of it arose in their awareness. All of it arose in their awareness out of the lived experience of it, a coming to life and fullness and direction and hope, when what it seemed like at first was all death and emptiness, chaos and despair. Similar to the spring of the earth. All that we want to hightail it away from, death, emptiness, chaos, the unknown, is exactly where the new shoots of new life emerge, not as full-grown stalks of amazingness, but delicate, vulnerable, barely noticeable emergences. What can we say but that that's the way God seems to work, in subtlety? Until suddenly, like we walk outside and say, oh my gosh, how did spring suddenly come upon us? We wake up and say, oh my gosh, out of this terrible situation, out of this plague, this isolation, this near economic standstill, this death, emerged all of this. Or to quote John Lennon, everything will be okay in the end, and if it's not okay, then it's not the end. That's the promise of Easter, that it'll all be okay. But we are called to be participants also in the making of things okay. And that's maybe what God's winks are for, to remind us that we are not alone, that there are larger and more benevolent forces at play than we could possibly imagine, that love is here and does not die. And then with hearts filled to overflowing, we do not linger too long at death's door, but continue onward to participate in the unfolding of God's miraculous life.